Kieran Valmont had known hunger. He had known the bitter sting of cold winters, where the heating bill remained unpaid because there was simply no money. He had known the sound of his mother crying behind closed doors, muffling her sobs with an old pillow so he wouldn't hear. But he always heard. He always knew. And from as early as he could remember, he had made himself a promise: one day, he would never feel powerless again. Born in the crumbling outskirts of Lethbridge, where broken streetlights flickered like dying stars, Kieran had never been handed a single advantage in life. His father had left before he was old enough to remember his face, leaving his mother, Helena, to raise him alone. She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and washing dishes at a late-night diner, just to keep them afloat. But no matter how hard she worked, poverty was a relentless enemy, always taking more than she could give. Kieran was different from the other kids. He didn't dream of becoming an athlete or a musician. He didn't fantasize about escaping in the back seat of a stolen car like some of his childhood friends, who saw crime as the only ticket out. No, Kieran had a mind built for war, and his battlefield was business. While other boys played in the cracked alleyways behind their buildings, he read anything he could get his hands on: old newspapers, abandoned library books, even financial reports discarded by office workers downtown. He absorbed knowledge like a starving man at a feast. At 16, he got his first job fixing broken computers in a repair shop run by a grumpy old man named Sal. Kieran didn't just fix computers, he studied them, took them apart, understood them better than most engineers twice his age. By 18, he had built his first rudimentary AI model, a crude but promising attempt at automation that Sal scoffed at. "Kid, people don't need computers thinking for them," the old man had grunted. "They need someone who knows how to fix what's broken." Kieran never forgot those words, though he would prove Sal wrong in ways neither of them could have imagined. By 22, he had dropped out of college, not because he wasn't capable, but because he was too impatient for the slow, plodding pace of academia. He wanted the real game, the high stakes of the business world. He started Valmont Industries in a cramped, windowless apartment, coding for days without sleep, fueled by caffeine and a relentless hunger that had nothing to do with food. His breakthrough came when he developed a revolutionary self-learning AI system, one that could optimize entire industries, from finance to medicine. Investors laughed at him. Big corporations ignored him. He was just another ambitious kid with a dream too big for his pockets. But Kieran had something none of them had: a refusal to accept failure. It took years of rejection, of pounding on doors that refused to open. But eventually, someone listened. A venture capitalist took a chance on him, and that was all he needed. His AI system changed the world overnight. Companies lined up to buy his technology. Governments sought his expertise. Money poured in like a flood, turning his once empty bank account into a bottomless well. By 35, Kieran Valmont was no longer the boy from the broken streets. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, a man who had beaten the world at its own game. But as he sat in his glass-walled office, overlooking a skyline that he now owned a piece of, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. What was all this wealth for, if the world he had left behind was still suffering? The boy who had once been powerless had become the most powerful man in the room. But power meant nothing if he did nothing with it. And Kieran Valmont had never been the kind of man to do nothing. The streets of Lethbridge had changed since Kieran Valmont's childhood, yet the air still carried the same biting chill, the same restless whispers of forgotten dreams. As his luxury car hummed softly along the dimly lit roads, he barely recognized the place he had once called home. The towering buildings, the neon signs, the polished sidewalks, none of it could erase the undercurrent of struggle woven into the city's bones. He had spent years chasing wealth, believing that success would sever his ties to this past. But tonight, something pulled him back. At a nearly deserted bus stop, his eyes caught a frail figure, hunched over against the wind. The woman's coat was threadbare, her shoes scuffed beyond repair. She clutched a plastic bag close to her chest, as if it contained her entire world. Kieran wasn't sure why he slowed down. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was guilt. Rolling down the window, he called out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" The woman flinched slightly, turning to him with tired eyes that had seen too much. "I've survived worse," she murmured, her voice rasping like old paper. Something in her tone unsettled him. He parked the car and stepped out, the cold slapping against his expensive tailored coat. He hadn't felt real cold in years. "Do you need a ride somewhere?" he asked, standing a respectful distance away. She let out a soft, almost amused breath. "And where would I go?" That question stopped him. The usual responses, home, work, a friend's place, none of them seemed to apply to her. "I don't mean to intrude, but, do you have anywhere to stay?" The woman, Eloise Carter, studied him for a long moment before sighing and motioning to the bench beside her. To his own surprise, Kieran sat. It was the first time in decades he had lowered himself, literally, to the same level as someone the world had cast aside. Eloise didn't beg, didn't complain. Instead, she told him her story in quiet, steady words. She had once been a nurse, working long hours in understaffed hospitals, taking care of strangers while barely making enough to survive. When her husband fell sick, the medical bills swallowed what little they had. She worked until her body couldn't anymore, and when she was finally too weak, the system that she had spent her life serving simply discarded her. "I used to believe in hard work," she said, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "I used to believe that if you gave everything you had, the world would take care of you in return. Funny how that works." Kieran swallowed. He could hear the echoes of his own mother in Eloise's voice, the exhaustion, the quiet resignation, the unspoken plea for something better. He had built an empire on the idea that success belonged to those who never stopped pushing forward. But Eloise had pushed. She had worked. And still, the world had left her behind. His billions suddenly felt meaningless. "How do you keep going?" he asked, his own voice quieter than he expected. Eloise smiled, a small, weary thing. "Because there are still people out there worth fighting for." The words lingered in the freezing air, wrapping around Kieran like a revelation. He had spent his entire life chasing numbers, acquisitions, power plays, convincing himself that wealth was the ultimate goal. But in that moment, sitting on a frozen bench beside a woman who had lost everything, he realized he had been fighting for the wrong thing all along. That night, as Kieran drove away, he already knew what he had to do. Everything would change. The next morning, the world awoke to a storm unlike any other. News outlets exploded with the headline: "Kieran Valmont to give away 90% of his fortune, a billionaire's last act?" Social media was in an uproar. Comment sections overflowed with disbelief, admiration, and outrage. Was he insane? Was this some kind of PR stunt? Investors panicked. Valmont Industries stock plummeted by 42% in mere hours. Board members scrambled to contain the damage, demanding an emergency meeting. In the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Valmont Tower, a storm was brewing. The board of directors, composed of men in tailored suits and women with steel in their eyes, sat rigidly, their expressions a mixture of anger and fear. At the head of the table, Kieran sat, perfectly calm, as voices rose around him. "This is reckless, Kieran," his CFO, Martin Graves, snapped, slamming a hand onto the table. "You're not just giving away money. You're destabilizing the company, putting thousands of jobs at risk. Do you even understand what you're doing?" Kieran interlocked his fingers, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "I understand perfectly," he said evenly. "No, you don't," another board member hissed. "This company was built on your vision, on power, on precision. You can't just throw it all away." A scornful chuckle left Kieran's lips. Throw it away? He leaned forward, his voice deceptively quiet, but carrying the weight of finality. I've spent decades building something that never truly mattered. We break records, we crush competitors, we amass wealth, and yet, every day, I drive past streets filled with people who have nothing. Tell me, what part of that legacy is worth preserving? Silence. Then, Adrian Valmont, his younger brother and business partner, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He had remained silent throughout the meeting, but now his voice cut through like a blade. So this is what it's come to? Guilt? Adrian's words were laced with venom. You wake up one morning, see a few homeless people, and decide to burn down everything we've built? Kieran exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Not guilt. Clarity. Adrian scoffed. Clarity? Let me give you some clarity, brother. You're destroying Valmont Industries. You're throwing away power, influence, and control, all because of some bleeding heart fantasy. You think the world will thank you? They'll take your money and move on. And when you have nothing left, what then? Kieran held his brother's gaze, his voice steady. Then, Adrian, for the first time in my life, I'll be free. The words landed like a slap. The room was thick with tension, a battlefield of unspoken truths and shattered expectations. You're making a mistake, Adrian finally muttered, shaking his head. Kieran stood. No, he said. The mistake was thinking wealth was the end goal. It never was. With that, he walked out. Hours later, at a packed press conference, Kieran stepped onto the stage. The flashes of cameras flickered like lightning. Reporters fired questions like bullets. Mr. Valmont, why are you doing this? Are you walking away from Valmont Industries? What does this mean for the company's future? He raised a hand, and the chaos subsided. He took a breath, then spoke into the microphone. For years, I believed success was measured by wealth, by numbers, by power. But I was wrong. True success is measured by the impact we leave on the world, by how we lift others instead of just ourselves. That is why today, I pledge to give away 90% of my wealth. To build hospitals. To fund education. To give people hope. A stunned silence filled the room. Then, an eruption of noise, cheers, arguments, disbelief. Kieran stepped back from the podium, unshaken. For the first time in decades, he felt weightless. The moment Kieran Valmont's decision made headlines, the world erupted. His name, once synonymous with power and unshakable financial genius, was now met with outrage, confusion, and disbelief. Television anchors called him reckless, investors accused him of sabotaging his own empire, and social media boiled over with theories. Some called him a saint, others a lunatic. But the worst betrayal came from the person he least expected, Adrian Valmont, his own brother. Adrian had stood beside Kieran from the beginning, his most trusted ally. While Kieran envisioned the future, Adrian handled the numbers, ensuring Valmont Industries remained an unstoppable force. They had built the empire together, suffered losses together, fought battles side by side. But that unity shattered the moment Adrian stormed into Kieran's office, his face a mask of barely restrained fury. Tell me this is a joke. Adrian's voice was low, dangerous. Kieran met his brother's gaze calmly. It's not. Adrian slammed a newspaper onto the desk, the bold headline screaming. Kieran Valmont gives away 90% of his fortune, a philanthropic gamble or a billionaire's meltdown? You didn't even discuss this with me. Adrian's voice shook. You're throwing away everything we built. Everything. Do you have any idea what this will do to the company? To our legacy? Kieran leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. I know exactly what it will do, he said. It will save lives. Adrian laughed bitterly, shaking his head. No, Kieran. It will destroy lives, our employees, our investors, the people who have trusted us. The stock is already crashing. You're not saving anyone, you're sinking the ship and calling it salvation. Kieran exhaled slowly. I didn't build this company just to watch the world rot while we sit in glass towers, Adrian. His voice was quiet, but firm. We have more money than we could spend in 100 lifetimes. And yet, every day, I see people starving on streets we drive past. You think that's success? Adrian slammed his fist onto the desk, his composure breaking. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just money. It's power. Influence. Security. You throw that away, and what are you left with? A fantasy? A world where one man's kindness can undo a system built on control? Kieran stood, his piercing gaze unwavering. Maybe that's exactly the world I want to build. Silence stretched between them like a canyon too deep to cross. Adrian's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. Then, slowly, he pulled a folder from his coat and placed it on the desk. What is this? Kieran asked, though he already knew. A lawsuit, Adrian said coldly. I filed an injunction to block your donation. You don't get to make this decision alone. You don't get to burn our legacy to the ground. Kieran's heart clenched, but he refused to let the pain show. His own brother, the man he had trusted more than anyone, was standing against him, not as family, but as an adversary. You would do this? Kieran asked quietly. Adrian's face was unreadable. I have to. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped Kieran's lips. No, Adrian. You don't have to. You just choose to. For the first time, Adrian hesitated. But it was too late. He had made his choice, and so had Kieran. As Adrian turned to leave, Kieran called after him, his voice filled not with anger, but sorrow. I hope, one day, you understand why I did this. Adrian didn't turn back. The door clicked shut behind him, the finality of it settling deep in Kieran's chest. Outside, the world raged. Inside, Kieran Valmont stood alone, knowing he had just lost the person he had always believed would stand by him, but he had no regrets. Kieran Valmont stood at the threshold of his new life, a man once draped in the cold steel of corporate power, now stripped to nothing but his ideals. He had walked away from Valmont Industries, the empire he had spent his entire existence building, watching as its boardroom wolves tore each other apart in their scramble to salvage what they could. His name, once spoken with reverence in financial circles, had become a cautionary tale, the billionaire who lost his mind. The media was ruthless. Valmont's insanity, a fortune wasted, one headline sneered. The fall of a tech titan, read another. Talk show hosts mocked his decision, calling it a billionaire's midlife crisis. But Kieran didn't care. For the first time, he felt unshackled. With what remained of his personal wealth, he traveled, not by private jet, not in luxury cars, but by foot, by train, by bus, by the means of those he had once ignored. He walked through the slums of Mumbai, the war-torn ruins of Syria, the hurricane-ravaged streets of New Orleans. He sat with orphan children, held the hands of the sick, listened to the stories of the forgotten. One night, in a remote village in Cambodia, Kieran sat beside a young girl named Mai, who had lost her parents to a preventable disease. She clutched a tattered doll, her only possession, and whispered, "If my parents had medicine, they would still be here." Kieran clenched his fists. He had spent his life hoarding billions while people like Mai's parents had died over a few dollars worth of medicine. He had built skyscrapers, not hospitals. He had invested in artificial intelligence, not in saving human lives. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't enough to donate money. He had to rebuild the world he had helped break. So he did. He started with hospitals, state-of-the-art medical centers in impoverished regions, fully funded and free for those who needed them. He poured resources into clean water initiatives, into education, into microloans for struggling families. What began as a billionaire's act of redemption turned into a revolution. At first, they doubted him. "This is just another PR stunt," the skeptics scoffed. "He'll get bored and come running back to his luxury life," the cynics sneered. But Kieran never went back. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and worked. He laid bricks, dug wells, sat in on classrooms, and learned the names of every person he helped. And slowly, the world started to believe in him. Then, something extraordinary happened. Other billionaires began to follow. A ripple turned into a wave. One by one, the world's wealthiest began to question the purpose of their empires. Some dismissed him as a fool, but others listened. The more he gave, the more they realized the truth: true power wasn't in wealth. It was in changing lives. Kieran no longer owned private islands or sat at the helm of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But he owned something far greater: a movement, a legacy, a world he had helped change. And for the first time in his life, he was finally free. Kieran Valmont sat on a worn-out wooden bench, gazing at the golden hues of the setting sun. The playground before him was alive with laughter, children running, climbing, and shouting with the boundless energy of youth. A few feet away, teachers watched over them, their voices gentle yet firm. The school, the Valmont Academy, stood proudly behind them, a testament to what one man's decision could change. Kieran exhaled, his breath slow and deliberate. His body, once an indomitable force that commanded boardrooms, now bore the weight of time. His hands, which had once signed billion-dollar deals, were lined with wrinkles. His fortune was nearly gone, but for the first time in his life, he felt lighter. Freer. A quiet shuffling of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He turned his head and found himself looking at Eloise Carter. She was no longer the frail, forgotten woman he had met years ago at a cold, lifeless bus stop. Now, she stood with quiet dignity, a woman who had reclaimed her life. She wore a simple, warm coat, her silver hair neatly pinned back. But her eyes, those same weary eyes, now held something new. Something brighter. She smiled as she sat beside him. "You made this happen," she said softly. Kieran chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Eloise. You did." She studied him for a moment, her gaze filled with something unspoken. Then, after a pause, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. Carefully, she smoothed it out and handed it to him. Kieran Valmont, the man who gave it all away. He stared at the headline. Beneath it was a photo of him, much younger, standing before a crowd, announcing his decision to donate his fortune. The article recounted his journey, his rise, his fall, and his rebirth as something more than a billionaire. "They're calling you a legend," Eloise mused. "Some say you're a fool. Others say you're the greatest man of our time." Kieran smiled faintly. "Funny how they only decide after it's too late for me to care." Eloise laughed, a real, genuine laugh. Then, her expression softened, and she placed a hand on his. "You gave people hope, Kieran. You gave them something money never could." For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching the children play. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the fallen leaves at their feet. Then, Kieran inhaled deeply, as if savoring the moment. His eyes drifted upward, tracing the fiery colors of the sky. He had spent his youth chasing power, his middle years unraveling his mistakes. Now, in the twilight of his life, he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: not wealth, not legacy, but peace. His fingers tightened briefly around Eloise's before his grip slackened. A single tear slid down her cheek as she realized, he was gone. For a moment, time stood still. The playground's laughter faded into the distance, the wind stilled, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if nature itself mourned him, the sky darkened, streaked with the last dying embers of the sun. Eloise squeezed his hand one last time. "Thank you, Kieran," she whispered, her voice breaking. And as the first star blinked into existence, the world moved forward, forever changed by the man who had given everything, only to find everything he had ever needed.